Many people have heard about the Lolita Island scandal recently, but many online videos just use this as a basis for speculation. In fact, 3 years ago, the United States produced a full documentary about the Epstein case, which detailed how Epstein once wielded immense power in the United States. The story begins in 2003 when a New York journalist was preparing a special feature on Epstein. The journalist initially planned the feature on Epstein's successful life, but one of Epstein's archenemies offered to give the journalist some juicy gossip. This adversary led the journalist to interview a painter named Maria, who immediately began recounting her past with Epstein. 10 years ago, Maria, then a college student, took 3 of her paintings to an art exhibition. A client offered $12,000 for one of her oil paintings, but the principal suddenly intervened, threatening Maria with her studies and forcing her to give the 3 paintings to Epstein for free. The young woman, unable to withstand the school's threat, had no choice but to give them away. Epstein even came to Maria and assured her that it was definitely not a bad deal. Maria initially thought marrying a wealthy man was a great opportunity, but 2 months later, after graduating from university, she was only offered a high-paying job as a doorman by Epstein. Epstein's real target was Maria's 16-year-old sister, and Maria was merely a stepping stone for Epstein to get closer to Anne. To get closer to 16-year-old Anne, he lied and offered to fund a school trip to Thailand for Anne's entire class. As a result, before setting off, he tricked Annie into taking him on his private plane under the pretext that Maria was his employee and he needed to take care of her family. He then flew to his desert ranch in New Mexico. What happened there is best left unsaid, but Annie was traumatized after returning home and told her sister Maria about what happened at the ranch. This caused Maria, who had also recently been assaulted by Epstein, to break down completely. Maria suddenly remembered the 3 paintings she had given Epstein, in which the models were her 2 younger sisters. She realized that Epstein had only approached her because he was attracted to one in the paintings, and even more terrifyingly, the other model in the paintings was her 12-year-old younger sister. Terrified that her 3rd sister might also be manipulated by this man, Maria immediately called the police. However, the police refused to handle the case, citing that the New York Police Department had no jurisdiction over New Mexico. Maria then pinned her last hope on the FBI, who readily agreed to take action. But nearly 10 years passed without any further news. Just as the reporter was preparing to publish Maria's story, he received a call from Epstein. Epstein's exact words were, "If I feel uncomfortable after your report is published, your whole family will suffer." The reporter was initially prepared to confront Epstein directly, but after learning of her pregnancy, Epstein made a chilling statement. He knew all the doctors in every hospital in New York and could guarantee her child's safe delivery. Meanwhile, the reporter's newspaper also received death threats from Bethel and Bullitt. Ultimately, under pressure, the newspaper had to cancel publishing Maria's story and instead feature a special issue praising Epstein. There's a lot of information about a complex figure like Epstein. Just how much power did Epstein wield in New York back then? He had a mole in the police department, connections in hospitals, newspapers dared not speak ill of him, and the Department of Justice, the Department of Political and Legal Affairs, and local judges were all his cronies. He even had 8 private lawyers, each a seasoned veteran with over 20 years of experience. Furthermore, Trump and Epstein, who lived in the same affluent neighborhood, had been friends for 15 years because they shared a common interest: beautiful women. However, Trump had some boundaries and knew he couldn't have affairs with minors, while Epstein had no such boundaries whatsoever. At the time, it was common knowledge among students in the Palm Beach area that one could get money by servicing an older man living in a Palm Beach villa. For those under 15, it's $300 per session. For those under 17, it's $200. And 18-year-olds are considered too old and not allowed into the villa. This continued until a police officer received a report that a woman had found $300 on her 14-year-old adopted daughter. Under questioning, the adopted daughter admitted that she earned the money by giving massages to an older man. As for whether it was a legitimate massage, Those in the know understand. The Palm Beach police, overflowing with a sense of justice, wanted the woman to come forward and accuse Epstein. However, when the woman learned that the older man was Epstein, she immediately said she would pretend she hadn't called the police. And when the police applied for a search warrant to search Epstein's house, they were tipped off by a colleague with a mole, and by the time they arrived, all the video footage had already been deleted. After finally finding a few victims willing to accuse Epstein, the judge, who had also been bribed by Epstein, only sentenced Epstein to 1 year in prison for soliciting prostitution, despite the victim's accusations. Epstein's lawyer then paid for his release on the same day. Meanwhile, the victims who were willing to come forward to accuse Epstein fared much worse, being constantly monitored and harassed by people hired by Epstein. The helpless victims and local police had no choice but to hand the case over to the higher-level FBI. Do you know what evidence the U.S. police used to indict Epstein for sexually assaulting underage victims? At the time, the victims reported that Epstein's genitals were pyramid-shaped, thin at the front and thick at the back. During the hearing, the police demanded that Epstein produce his own genitals to prove his innocence. Isn't this tantamount to a public execution of Epstein? Who would deliberately display the thing in public? To avoid having his genitals testify in court, Epstein directly admitted his guilt, but insisted that the victims were all prostitutes, and that he was merely instigating prostitution. In the United States, this crime carries a maximum sentence of less than 2 years and a fine of $100. Epstein was ultimately sentenced to 18 months in prison for being a pimp, but he never spent a full day in jail. His lawyer was very effective, securing him parole on the grounds that Epstein needed to work. This allowed him to spend 12 hours a day outside the prison, meaning he only needed to go to jail to sleep each night. Furthermore, the prison guards responsible for monitoring him received an extra $40 per hour from Epstein. The victims, hearing that Epstein was still at large while in prison, were naturally unhappy and formed an organization jokingly referred to as the Avengers, urging other victims to continue their lawsuits against Epstein. The results of their outcry were shocking. It turns out Epstein didn't just target local victims. There were also victims in the UK, France, and Spain. The youngest victim was only 12 years old at the time. These victims have been advocating for nearly 11 years, and they've all gone from beautiful young women to middle-aged women. Until 2019, when a new FBI prosecutor took office, whether influenced by powerful figures or moved by the victims, he immediately announced the reopening of the Epstein case from over a decade ago. At the latest hearing, it seemed that the Avengers were forming a team to confront Epstein directly. Although the hearing was not open to the public, sources say that Epstein's lawyers attempted to secure $500 million in bail and had arranged for fake passports, planning to flee immediately upon approval. However, this time it seems someone is determined to get Epstein, refusing to grant him any bail whatsoever. Epstein seemed to know he couldn't escape this time, so he simply revealed all the past pimping dealings involving these powerful figures. As for who they were, those who have been following the story probably already know. But just days before the court hearing, Epstein mysteriously committed suicide in prison. Coincidentally, his cellmate was moved to a different cell that day. The prison guard was asleep, and the security camera was broken. As for whether Epstein committed suicide or was murdered, only the bigwigs behind the scenes probably know the answer.